so, well, the people who have tried to destroy unions have been so successful in creating memes around the idea that unions don't have a reason to exist anymore, that the public sector and the private sector should understand that they need to give up workers, that is, their pensions and wages in order to help us all pull our weight to balance budgets, and that the result is that people, even in the movement itself, no longer have the ability to articulate what's so important about not racing to the bottom. And I think that's also true in terms of economic development and watching what happens in Janesville, which happens everywhere. I mean, I was in New Jersey last night and heard the same exact story about a community there giving away hundreds of millions of dollars to bring AT&T from about 20 miles away to their community. So there's no net gain whatsoever. It's just the ability for large corporations to take advantage of a down economy and use that leverage to be able to get public money to expand their own businesses. And there's no net job gain, and wages get depressed. So that's sort of my perspective, but Jane has been on the ground for a long time working with unions, and I think you should chime in here.
Hi. So nice to be here. I love this facility. Thanks, Sarah. And it's a total pleasure to be hanging out with Brad on this film. We both met at a writers and sort of artist retreat colony. I was writing and he was making films. I think to me that the most interesting thing is that you were sort of talking about an allegory, a story for the rest of the nation, and in a book that I just published called Raising Expectations and Raising Hell, it was similarly telling a story of an allegory, which is, the allegory in this case was sort of the other side of Janesville, meaning what was going up in that community, which is what's going up in a lot of communities, by the way, are hospitals, which if you haven't been out of New York for a while, you will miss the story that the economic development strategy in every town and every city in this country right now is healthcare, based on an aging economy, an aging population, baby boomers, right? It's like, it's a sort of a joke, but the part that's not a joke, meaning the whole country is not going to survive on healthcare. But what's relevant to me from the story is I had spent a decade cutting my teeth helping workers, hospital workers, form unions. And the main message to me about one of the things that we have to be doing in this country is we have to take ourselves back to the 1920s. We have to remember that in 1929, 1925, when someone went to work in an auto plant in Janesville, or frankly any place where we were putting up auto plants in the 1920s, by the way, they weren't considered good jobs, and they weren't considered great jobs, and in fact they weren't good jobs until thousands and thousands, in case hundreds of thousands of workers sat down and took over the facilities and did very militant direct action and formed unions and turned what were not very good jobs, where they had very little rights and not very good pay and horrible conditions and people were getting their fingers chopped off and everything else. And it was through human struggle that people collectively turned an auto worker's job into a good job. And so what we need to be doing in 2013 is the very same thing in sort of the new economy. And there's been a gap and a lag time in, but the story that I have to tell is a little bit more of a positive story than I think maybe how we're left hanging at the end of what's happening in sort of the Rust Belt, because my own experience is we were taking jobs, like Sydney's walking into the lab tech job. Spent a lot of time with lab techs in the last 15 years. And you know, we were going into non-unionized hospitals in America and helping workers form unions and transitioning a lab tech job at $9 an hour or $8.50 an hour with no benefits into a job with fully employer-paid health care for the worker and their entire family. These were workers who were paying $400 a month before the union fight began. $400 a month for their health care benefits, right, for their dependent coverage for their kids. And you know, 8 months later, after a ferocious union busting campaign that the workers overcame and won, and sat at the bargaining table, and then 2,000 hospital workers went from having crappy jobs in a hospital to having good jobs with health care for their families. So the same story that happened with the auto sector, you know, virtually 100 years ago, is sort of part of what we have to be doing in America right now. And people in New York and people who maybe haven't experienced doing shift work, I think need to get behind supporting unionization again in a way that we don't really appreciate at this point in America. And because I think the very same dynamic is playing out in this country. The question is, what will we do about it? It sure as hell wasn't easy for workers in the 1930s to form unions. They were beaten, clubbed, murdered, killed, attacked. It's never been easy to help workers form unions. And it's not particularly easy right now, but it's certainly not impossible. And that's partly the story that I tell about working in the new economy with mostly women workers who, frankly, they literally, in a one contract campaign would change their entire future. And that's between 1995 and now. So part of the dynamic is that we have to get behind reteaching collective action in America and what it means and how we do it.
Speaking of women workers, something that I found very unique about this film is that the three main characters that are featured, the workers, are all female. And it's never, you never make a point of it like, hey everyone, I have 3 female characters. But that is not the visual that most people see when they think about labor and when they think about manufacturing jobs. Can you tell us more about what that is?
Yeah, sure. So it was a really deliberate choice to choose to follow women workers. And it sort of occurred to me right when I started going down to Janesville to find out what was happening right after the plant closed. And I started going to these, they were called Java jobs. Basically, a lot of the workers didn't feel comfortable going for job benefits at the job center, which you saw in the movie, but they would feel comfortable at the local union hall. So I would start attending these sort of coffee clutch type activities where people would give each other tips about how to get benefits, get into school, whatever it might be. And there were a ton of women there. And so I started understanding that, the story of men losing their jobs, these kinds of jobs, while really important, is, I think, largely told out there. And it's often a kind of wrestling with identity. What does my life mean if I can't be the breadwinner for the household, etc.? But that story about women hasn't really been told. And it also had a different dynamic, because in these different coffee clutches I was attending, the conversation was about caregiving. It was about, what are we going to do with kids, and how are we going to work out the activities of the household and sustain the household. And to me, if the story was really about people leaving, why not tell that story from the person who was sort of the primary stakeholder in caregiving in those families? So that was number one. And number two is that there are a ton of women working on the line and doing shift work. And I don't think that the average person who hasn't done shift work really knows that. So it was a way to try to bring that out.
Mm-hmm. And James, something that we were talking about earlier is just how, and I'm a New Yorker and I love New Yorkers, but I do feel like there is somewhat of an ignorance in the city about feeling like this story isn't about our city. I can't relate to a manufacturing town. I can't relate to what used to be the auto industry. I can't relate to how do you tell people in places like New York City why this matters to them?
Well, I mean, I think one thing is that it is happening in New York City.
Right.
There's organizations in New York City like Make the Road New York, working with one of the unions in New York, who just helped 5 car washes worth of workers in Queens, I think, and parts of Brooklyn, form a union. And as most people know, I think there's a ton of fast food workers in New York City who are trying to figure out how to form a union in McDonald's and in Burger King and a bunch of crappy jobs in New York City. So, I mean, there's two things. One is we can't exist as an island. I think that's becoming more and more clear. I mean, New York City is literally, and not sometimes, depending on part of the city, an island. But we can't exist as sort of just bookends, right, with sort of like California and New York, and, we're getting outvoted. I mean, just take a look at what's happening in Washington, D.C., right? So, but I also think it's just, there's plenty of work that people right here in New York City could be doing to support a working class, a working poor group of workers in New York City. There's been a failed attempt to try and organize the green groceries. There's been a ton of failed attempts at retail in New York City. And the result is that we do have an increasing sort of both informal economy and non-unionized growing private sector economy in New York. And I think that when we just think of like the big government jobs in New York City, we think of the healthcare sector, we have a powerful healthcare workers union, and a couple of unions in New York City that are sort of powerful, but the truth is there is a growing non-union New York. And every New Yorker here could very well make a decision to get actively involved in trying to support the workers right in New York City who have yet to have the ability to form a union. And they're not having an easy time, and they get fired, and their places close down, and there's plenty of it right in our state. And if you go right outside of New York City, from the hostess plant to, right, I mean, there's the very same dynamic that we sort of see in Wisconsin goes on in the state of New York, from Long Island to upstate to, so plenty of work to do in New York City, just, you know, period, because it's coming our way fast. And one last comment, which I say a lot when I'm in a more explicitly, like when I'm talking with workers who are doing a training with Sons of Workers, or which I was doing in Seattle a couple weeks ago, and, you know, I asked a bunch of unionized folks there how many members they thought they would have in the union that they were in if the Supreme Court took the whole country right to work. Yeah. So as safe as New York City feels, if you're paying close attention to the Supreme Court, which I do, and probably many people here do, but if you're paying close attention also to what they're doing on unions in the last few years in terms of the voting, we're like one Supreme Court decision away from the whole country being right to work. And that's going to change the dynamic in New York City very, very quickly. So New York City is not safe. New York State is certainly not safe. And doing some, you know, it isn't like you go into schools, it isn't like you go anywhere in this country anymore and get a basic education about how did we ever make any job good. Jobs weren't, there's almost no boss, especially the guy at Whole Foods who makes me crazy. There's almost no boss who's ever sort of woken up and decided to create a good job. It's workers collectively struggling to change conditions, which is what makes jobs good and sets a standard. And maybe the most single annoying comment of any of those business people in that film, actually, for me, is like the loser from one of those bank meetings who says, you know, Wisconsin, the problem with Wisconsin is, if there was ever, it used to be that whatever federal standard there was, we always went above that. Like that was a problem, right? And he's like that was a problem. That in Wisconsin, because they had such a strong union culture, they decided to go above federal minimums, right? It was like, are you kidding me? You know, anyway. Yeah.
Just so I want to open up to the audience. If you want to speak, you can just raise your hand. That would be great. Comments, questions? Yes.
I have more comments, but I just wanted to congratulate you on the film. It really spoke to me as a single mother who's had to go to work sick for my child sick and without job security. Just another comment. I was also just really in awe how you found the structure that added there. It just seemed like a bear of a job because you had some really strong main characters. I'm wondering what you grappled with, and I have really informed you.
Thank you. I have to give a lot of credit to my editor, to Leslie Simmer, who is with Cartemquin Films. And you know, when I moved from here to Milwaukee, I didn't find a thriving documentary community in Milwaukee, so I sort of sought one out in Chicago, and have been very fortunate to get to work with Cartemquin. And between me and all my note cards and Gordon Quinn at Cartemquin, who has a sort of miraculous ability, even though he's losing his eyesight, he can edit a film in his head, which is great skill to have around in the house. And Leslie, who is really an incredibly talented editor. And you know, we struggle too, because obviously it would be easier to tell this story if we had less than 5 main characters. It's really hard to do that, as you all know, you're filmmakers. But I felt like if you sacrificed any of them, you lost a nuance that was really important to the balance that you get in the whole story and the humanity of the story. Actually, the PBS version, we had to cut Angie out, which broke my heart for all the reasons you can imagine, but also I think takes out a story that's really important, which is Angie is not a labor activist. She's a mom who is thankful that she has a union job. And if it weren't for the union, she would have been completely out without any alternatives, with her son trying to rehabilitate from a crippling car accident. So losing that story was really hard, but I really appreciate the compliment, and I wish Leslie was here to hear it. I will